There you go.
Excellent. Thanks, Allison. Appreciate that. So we are going to get started here, and people can trickle in, and we'll just let people in as they come. Normally, when I teach this class in person, we go around the room and I'll say who we are. So I just thought, if anybody wants to put anything in the chat, letting us know if you have a garden, something that you're excited to grow this year, something new that you're growing. I'd love to see sort of what people are doing this year. And I'll take that time to introduce myself. My name is Hanna Mosca. I am the farm and greenhouse manager for Grow Pittsburgh, which means I oversee a team of people working at Shiloh Farm in North Point Breeze.
Okay, all right.
At
Bye.
the Frick Greenhouse, also in North Point Breeze, just a half a mile from Shiloh Farm, as well as our newest site through Grow Pittsburgh, which is Garden Dreams, where we are currently in the process of building 2 new greenhouses, which we're really excited about. So, and something I'm really excited about this year that is new for me is honeyberries. I've never grown those before, and maybe if you have, put it in the chat. I'm excited to grow them. They're similar to a blueberry, but don't have the acidic soil requirements. So I'm excited to try those. I have them planted both at my personal garden at my house, as well as we're planting them at Shiloh this year. So if you are ever in the area, we have our farm stand at Shiloh every Thursday, 2:30 to 6:30. We'll be starting early this year with vegetable and flower and herb seedlings, and then going into the produce season, we'll continue the farm stand all the way through October. So excited about that. So but yeah, so keep putting yourselves in the chat if you want to share what you're doing this year, if you've got any fun things that you're growing. Just wanted to share the mission of Grow Pittsburgh. We are an organization that our whole mission is to teach people how to grow food and to promote the benefits that gardens bring to our neighborhoods. And we do that in a variety of ways. I manage production sites, but we also have a whole team of people working on community gardens. So if you're looking to get involved in a community garden in your neighborhood, or a school garden, that's what these adorable children are part of our school garden program. So we have multiple departments working in lots of different ways to teach people how to grow food and promote the benefits that gardens bring to our neighborhoods. So tonight is all about figuring out the best way to start a garden. So we are going to talk about a couple of things. We're going to talk about site selections and considerations. We're going to talk about different types of gardens that you can start in your space, whether it be just a small patio or a deck or a whole big yard. We're going to talk about materials for those kinds of different gardens. We're going to talk about some garden planning, and particularly about urban soils. So again, feel free to put some things in the chat, and maybe Allison can sort of keep an eye on it, and then we can either answer them throughout the program. If it makes more sense to elaborate on anything, please ask if anything just needs clarification. Otherwise, we did leave, as Allison mentioned, a bunch of time at the end to ask a bunch of questions. So when talking about garden sites, the best thing to think about immediately is sunlight. When we're thinking about where we want to build a garden, sunlight is super, super important, especially if we're talking about vegetables. Nearly all vegetables need a 6-hour minimum of sunlight. So that is number one. And that you can figure that out in a couple of different ways at Grow Pittsburgh. Before we build gardens at schools or in community gardens, or certainly at our farms, we do something called a sun study to just watch where the sun is at any point in the day to make sure that that space is getting a 6-hour minimum. If you've never built a garden before, it's really great to just take a season to really understand the way that sun and water and all those kinds of things are sort of act on your garden space. So 6-hour minimum is super important. Certainly there are things that do not need that much sunlight, but for vegetables, the 6-hour is definitely a minimum, and many things thrive with much more than that. So, and then southern exposure, that's where you'll get the most sun. And we can talk more about that when we talk about building beds, but the southern exposure, if you've got any spaces that will get the most sun. So that's another consideration. Here in Pittsburgh, obviously, lots of us have very sloped yards. So that's something to think about when you're talking about building a garden space, either thinking about how you can use the slope and the drainage to your advantage, or maybe you want to avoid a slopey spot altogether. And that may not be possible, certain yards or garden spaces, it's not possible to completely avoid the slope, and that's okay. We can do a lot of things with slopes, but we just want to make sure that we are aware and build according to what the land that we have. And along with slope is drainage, and really making sure that we are watching if there's water, pooling in any part of our yard, or so if we've got standing water for sure, or if you notice that water is just running off and taking soil with it, drainage is super important in a vegetable garden. And you can see these raised beds here. That might be because the soil was really compacted and really clay heavy and it wasn't draining well. That raised bed is a great solution to that. Convenience may seem obvious, but if your garden is not located in a place that's really convenient, you might not get out there as often as the garden would appreciate. So having a space that is convenient, for example, in my yard, right down the bottom of my back steps is my herb garden. That's where I, go and harvest herbs nearly every day in the summertime. So having that really close to my kitchen was necessary for me. So and then water source. There's a lot of different things to take into consideration for water. Certainly things like rain barrels are really awesome at collecting water, but some years we just do not have as much rainfall as other years. So if you're relying on rain barrels, really understanding and knowing where you're going to get backup water from, because you don't want to be carrying like Culligan jugs of water to your community garden or to your backyard and that kind of thing. So having access to water, or maybe that's what you do want to do, but at least knowing what you're getting yourself into, a water source is super, super important. Either from, like I said, a rain barrel or a hose, or maybe your kitchen sink, not sure. So those are all things to take into consideration. The sun path, obviously, I just said, watching the sun, but obviously the sun is going to change throughout the year. We know that the winter sun path is much lower, coming at a much harsher angle than the summer path. And so that sun is going to change a lot. And depending on what you're planting, if you're just planting a summer garden, maybe that doesn't matter as much, but certainly that winter sun. So for a spring garden, the shadows and the way the sun moves is going to change. So just a thing to consider when, this winter sun path is so much lower. So you can see the 9 a.m. and 3 p.m. that changes dramatically from winter to summer. So paying attention to those things. Choosing your garden type, there's, this is a 3 of, possibilities for gardens, but obviously there are so many different ways you can do it. These are the 3 we're going to focus on, because these are the 3 kinds of things that we do throughout the city of Pittsburgh through Grow Pittsburgh, and is most common for people in their yards. So I have a couple of things here, and down at the bottom where it says Info Hub, I just wanted to let everybody know that that is on our website, and I'm happy to share some of those links afterwards also, but that's a place that you can go. Our Info Hub on our website has lots of information, and they're sort of a printed version of a lot of the things we're going to cover tonight, has more step-by-step information and that kind of thing. So any of the stuff in the bottom that says Info Hub, creating new garden spaces is the name of a document within our Info Hub. So choosing your garden type, we're talking about in-ground, raised beds, and containers. And those can be any different kinds of things. We've got here down on the bottom left, those are in-ground beds. The top left, that's a raised bed, but it's a pretty small, like not a very deep raised bed that can look a lot of different ways. I chose this photo on the top right. That I don't know if any of you have eaten at Dinette, the pizza place in East Liberty, but they had a fabulous rooftop garden that Sonia's father, I believe, started. And so they grew tons of tomatoes and peppers and arugula on the rooftop, and they had a whole self-watering bucket system that they did. And so these are a beautiful picture of their like very lush plants on their rooftop right in East Liberty, right by the like Whole Foods right there. So, and then I don't know, this picture was from a presentation that somebody else had put together, but I loved this image of these gentlemen with the truck bed planted with a bunch of greens. So, and I guess maybe tomatoes even further back, basil and other things. So I loved that image. So we are going to talk about different considerations and things you want to take that might help you make the choice of what kind of garden would be best for you. This picture on the top was taken by my friend Kelsey at the Hazelwood, previously the Hazelwood YMCA garden. And down on the bottom is the Homewood YMCA garden. I used to manage the YMCA garden program, and these gardens were a great representation of how many different kinds of things you can have. You can see in the background of the top one that we had sort of, they were 16-inch high raised beds. And then what you can't see, like sort of where Kelsey is taking that photo from, that was all in-ground beds. So we had a combination of styles of beds, and also obviously the high tunnel there. These blackberries were growing on the fence line. So multiple different kinds of garden beds there. And the things we took into consideration building these gardens: soil, this Homewood YMCA down below, that the old YMCA building is buried underneath there. So these trees, you know, they always say never to mound the mulch up. It looks like we really heavily mulched those trees, but actually that's a whole soil bed. We built the up for the trees because the old YMCA was buried underneath there. And it was really like, it was cement blocks and bricks and all that. So we, in partnership with Grow Pittsburgh, built up the tree beds. And so it's not solid mulch there, but that was absolutely determined because of the soil that was there. Contamination is absolutely a consideration, talking about heavy metals or, you know, certainly lead, especially with an old building buried underneath there. We always do soil testing before we build a site, and we'll talk more about that too. And drainage, that would be one of the biggest issues too with that rubble, is those trees would just hold so much water. So this would be a way to have some of that moisture, just have better drainage for those young trees there. And you can kind of get a sense of the slope here. These trees are built into it's sloping up towards us, and those two trees at the bottom, those are Asian pear trees, and those are at the bottom of the slope. So trees are a great way to, if you have a pretty sloped area, certainly the trees are a great way to do that. You can dig out great spaces for those, or terraced beds, things like that. Access and ability, of course, is super important in gardens. So the Homewood YMCA and Hazelwood Y both had, you know, either steep spaces or steps to get up to them. So thinking about access for yourself and also anybody else for who would be visiting the garden, thinking about how they'll move around the garden, and an ability in terms of, like, you know, maybe you want to build really tall raised beds so that you don't have to bend over as much. Or, you know, I just saw at Tractor Supply, they have pretty high like metal raised beds as well. So lots of different things that we can do to make gardening much easier on our bodies, especially if we have some, you know, some issues with bending or kneeling or those kinds of things. We can certainly build beds that are better for or easier on our bodies, I should say. Really thinking about what you want to grow is important for what kind of garden you would maybe want to build. If you want to be growing a bunch of fruit trees, maybe a container garden isn't the best one, but raised beds could be possible. And certainly some things you can grow in pots for a long time, fig trees or citrus trees, and bring them inside. But for an annual vegetable garden, and in-ground raised bed or containers would be fine. So, but thinking about what you want to grow, that can definitely determine what kind of garden. Aesthetics, what is beautiful to you? What do you like looking at? What do you want to have, you know, accessible and visible in your yard? Or in a community garden, thinking about the design of the garden. And I love, having containers mixed in with our in-ground beds and really creating more depth by using containers, but that's all about your personal preference and aesthetics. And certainly expense would be a part of that too. In-ground beds can be a lot more affordable than something like buying containers or buying lumber to build raised beds or corrugated metal or anything like that. So whatever your budget is, thinking about that before building a garden so you don't get halfway through and realize maybe you can't afford to continue the project. So expense would definitely be something to take into consideration. And here I have just like a quick comparison of things in ground that, like I said, can be very low cost. The soil temperature and moisture is most stable because, obviously the temperature of the earth will keep that as consistent with thawing or freezing. That would be something the most predictable, I would say. And we can know how moisture will move if we're paying attention and watching drainage and those kinds of things. There's also groundwater in the ground for plants to be able to pull from. So that's a lot more consistent than something like a raised bed or a container, which would dry out faster. Obviously, the quality of the existing soil would definitely be a concern, because if you have either a rubble underneath it, or maybe you have really beautiful soil that somebody else had been gardening before, so the quality of existing soil, it might just, or adding compost and other organic materials would definitely amend the soil too. And edging can be poorly defined depending on what kind of in-ground beds you build. Raised beds can be really great for poor soils, just building up. You can put down landscape fabric, and honestly, you could build a raised bed on just on a concrete driveway even. So raised beds are super convenient if you just want to build up and not mess with existing soil. Soil temperatures are variable, but they do warm up quickly in the springtime. So you'll often see that the snow is melted first in raised beds, which does allow you to get a jump start on the season, but it would also freeze faster later as well. So again, just variable, but can work to your advantage. Certainly, it can be aesthetically pleasing depending on what you like to, if you like the look of wooden raised beds, which I love, or metal, or bricks, lots of different things you can do with that. But it can be expensive. Obviously, if you're buying lumber to build a really large garden, that would definitely add up, especially something like cedar, which is one of the longest lasting woods for a garden bed. It would certainly add up, but it's also very beautiful. And containers are great because if you just have a little balcony, you can put some containers there. It allows for tender perennials, which means you could bring them inside. It's what I do with my citrus trees, bring them out in the summertime and then bring them back in for the winter. And it allows for just a larger variety, I would say, in your garden. It does require the most attention because containers lose fertility and water much quicker than a raised bed or an in-ground bed. So it does require more attention, and I think is a more challenging way to garden, but definitely can be very productive. I think there's a potential for less healthy plants simply because of the fertility. So really paying attention to that is important if you have containers, especially if you have small containers, which would use up the nutrients and water much quicker. So once we know what kind of space we want to do, containers or raised beds or in-ground beds, we need to prepare our space. So these are the different steps depending on whatever kind of garden you want to do. The in-ground beds, there's a couple different ways you can do it. This is an example from Shiloh Farm. I really love sheet mulching. I think it's a really effective way to kill the grass, but then it decomposes and it breaks down to add organic matter to the soil rather than removing it, which is also an option. So here you can see at Shiloh, there's these beautiful street trees right on Thomas Boulevard. And every year we were planting annual vegetables and struggling with the shade that the street trees provided. And so we were struggling to grow things, even things that we knew were, more shade tolerant lettuces and arugula and chard. They still were not growing super well. So we decided to just totally transform that space into a perennial space to grow things that would benefit from the shade rather than trying to fight it, because we as humans really appreciate the shade from the trees for lunchtime and for farm stand. And so what we did was we just used shovels to turn over the soil there in the top left photo. The second one on the top right, you can see we started to put down boxes, and we were reusing some used berry boxes because they had just been left in the shed and been covered in dirt and other stuff that you wouldn't want to put food into those boxes. So we use them as sheet mulch instead. And then the bottom left, you can see it was all ready for planting. And we actually, because we knew that it was going to be shaded, we also added wine cap mushrooms here. So, and you can see we dug out the soil all around it also. So those beds were ready for planting. So we did a layer of cardboard, and then we did a layer of wine cap mushroom spawn, and then the wood chips. And the wine caps start to spread throughout the wood chips and grow through there. And then the bottom right, you can see we planted right into that cardboard, nothing else there. We just softened the cardboard to be able to cut out around where we were going to plant. And we planted currants, cranberries, creeping thyme, and strawberries all around, with the mushrooms spread all throughout the wood chips. And then in the paths between there, we planted clover. So it would be a path that we could walk on and mow, but would add sort of an aesthetically pleasing green border around the wood chips. But certainly you could use wood chips as the path too. And it is something to keep in mind when you do start to go to make in-ground beds, is where you want your path to be. These paths are pretty narrow because we knew we could get a wheelbarrow in lots of other places. Typically our paths are 1 to 2 feet, with our beds being about 3 feet wide. And some of the farm we are transitioning to no-till this year. So you can see we just did one layer of the cardboard is certainly overlapping, but you can do one layer of cardboard, 8 to 10 layers of newspaper, and then we just did a wood chip mulch. You could use straw, you could use multiple different things depending on what you have accessible to you. And then the lasagna garden, that's a way you would layer green and brown materials like you would in a compost bin. Maybe some grass, maybe some leaves, so that will all break down and add a lot of nutrients to the soil, so that when you go to plant, it's all broken down and ready for your seedlings. So the lasagna garden, I would say, is better to start probably in the fall, so that you've got a lot of time for those materials to break down. Whereas we did this right in the spring and then planted right into it. And it worked great for us. And those beds, those are now filling out, and we're actually going to add some more things to that. So that's a great option, especially in a small space. Sheet mulching, I think, is a wonderful option. And cardboard is very readily accessible, which is great. So we just remove any tape or stickers, things like that. Tilling in the sod is a great option. We do that at Shiloh as well. We plant a cover crop and then till it in. You can rent a tiller. Also, you can rent a sod remover, especially if you're doing a really large space. Maybe just removing the sod is best and then composting that. But it is really great to be able to reuse sort of the organic material from the lawn if you can just incorporate it like we did. We just turned that over in that top left photo. We just turned the sod upside down. This is a great time to mention, if you are not familiar with the Grow Pittsburgh Garden Resource Center, it opens on Saturday. It's one of my most favorite programs that we have through Grow Pittsburgh. It's a tool lending library. And there is a converted shipping container where you can go and borrow tools, a tiller, which is why I'm bringing it up right now, all the way down to like hammers and pruners, shovels, all those kinds of things. And with your annual membership, you also get 5 buckets of compost, 5 buckets of wood chips, and 5 buckets of topsoil. So it's a really wonderful way to be able to learn about gardening, get access to tools that would otherwise, you'd have to maybe buy, a whole shed full of tools. This is a great way to just be able to borrow them for a one-time project or borrow them for a week. And then there's also books, and sometimes there's seedlings there. There's pest and disease control, and all of it's organic, just like we always grow at Grow Pittsburgh. So it's such a wonderful resource in the community, and that opens on Saturday. Again, there's a couple more info hub here: creating a new garden space and how to lasagna garden. Raised beds can be built, like I said, out of multiple different things. Cedar and white oak are really great options. Bricks and cinder blocks are certainly readily available in Pittsburgh. Lots of different building materials. Corrugated metal, as you can see in the top one. There's lots of different materials that you can use. On the bottom one, I think it's just like landscape edging, even really, just to create a border. And which, you know, you could be really creative. I've seen wine bottles, all sorts of things. I don't particularly like glass in the garden, but that's just a personal preference. And maybe that's a totally fine thing for your garden, but certainly if you have children, using something that's more sturdy would be great. And the biggest thing here with the paint and sealant and pressure treated and tires, these are all things that are not recommended, but are often very readily available. Boards or wood that is painted and sealed or pressure treated is not great, because those sort of chemicals that are used for those wood lumber can leach into the soil. So really avoiding any pressure treated wood is great, which is also why cedar is a really great option. And tires, there's not great research out there. I grew up, you know, using, my dad always grew potatoes in tires. So, and I'm here still teaching about gardening. So it's not a, you know, deadly by any means, but certainly something to at least take into consideration. I know tires, there's lots of tires in the world, they're hard to get rid of, but maybe not the best garden choice either. So it's up to you, but I'm weary of them at this point. For containers, some consideration, weight and size, certainly of the pots that I'm bringing in and out of my house. Definitely want to make sure that they are pots that I can move myself, so that I can move them in and out, and how heavy they are when they're full of plants, not just the weight and size of the container when it's empty, but also when it has a large plant in it. If you're planning on bringing it inside, or if you need to move it in the garden. So taking into consideration that a lot of the pots I use outside are plastic for that reason, because if I'm going to be moving them in and out, it's just much easier. Heat and porosities, obviously something like terracotta is going to act very different than plastic, both retaining heat and wicking moisture. Plastic holds the moisture much better than terracotta, but terracotta is also really great at wicking. So if you're wicking moisture, so if you're someone who is chronically overwatering, maybe terracotta is the way to go. And always making sure that there are drainage holes, because that's a surefire way to kill a container garden, is to not have any holes in the bottom of your pots. They'll just drown. So make sure that there is, and sometimes the containers that we buy do not have enough drainage, or they'll maybe have one hole in the center, and then you'll see that the bottom of the container has multiple other places. You just have to maybe take a screwdriver or a drill and just drill a couple more holes. They show you exactly where to do that on those plastic pots. So getting as many holes in there, certainly if it's filled with soil, that's not going to run right out. Having the drainage is really important, especially in the springtime when we get lots of rain, like today. Those drainage holes are really important. So now we're going to talk about soil, and I want to talk about a couple different things. And soil is so important, because it's what physically holds those plants and supports the plants. It's where the nutrients and the water are. So having a good foundation, I think that in the last couple of years, there's been a lot more focus on soil, which is so great, because that is really the foundation of the garden. If we don't have healthy, nutritious soil with good structure, the garden really cannot thrive. So it all comes back to soil, which is, again, really why it's so important that we take into consideration what kind of space we have, because if our garden is either really wet or it's really compacted or full of rubble, it might just be best to build up and start with fresh soil, because, and certainly we can add organic matter to bring life into soil that's in our yards. That's what I've done. I add leaf mulch every year and compost because my garden, you know, I just dug up the grass in the house that we bought here in Forest Hills. And so I needed to add a lot of organic matter to make that a space that we could grow things successfully. But I also had the soil tested. And so we knew that it was a space that would be good, but if not, then always, you know, doing a different kind of garden is better than fighting the soil. Starting with healthy soil is key. Soil aeration is really important. That's where roots and worms and all those things can live and thrive and really bring, again, a lot of life to the soil. So using a spading fork or a broad fork, if you are not tilling, that's a really great way to just loosen the soil, especially after, say, a winter and there's lots of water and all that sort of settling. Just adding some air into the soil is really great. You can also incorporate compost to sort of soften the soil, letting the worms do the work. This is Will Allen. He was a farmer in Milwaukee and called Growing Power. And he had these amazing vermicomposting systems with the worms. And I just love that image of him with the handful of worms. And you want to avoid compaction at any cost that you can. So that means not walking in the garden beds. And anytime it is really wet, that's we compact the soil so much quicker when the soil is really wet. So not working in the garden when it's really wet, and then again, at all costs, avoiding walking in the garden beds at all. And testing the soil. This is our Braddock farm. I love this image of the steel mill right in the back there. And we do test our soil very consistently, both for nutrients. We always test before we build for heavy metals, but then also test our soil consistently for nutrients, for pH, for all of those things. So before building a garden, getting a soil test is super, super important. And again, we have an info hub here about testing garden soil, but I'm going to talk about a couple more things. In Pittsburgh, lead in the soil is very common, unfortunately. And so we want to make sure that we get testing done for lead at a minimum. So I just wanted to let everybody know that we have at the Garden Resource Center, that's the GRC, in partnership with the Allegheny Conservation District, we have free lead testing in our soil. That's coming up April 24th, 10 to 2. Registration is required. So I can also send out that link or put it in the chat at the end of this presentation. Registration is required because we're trying to keep track of the number of people coming on site, because it is a smaller space. But you just bring a sample of soil in a clear plastic Ziploc, and then you'll get the results. At least when I did it, again, this was before COVID, but when I did it, I got the results the same day and found out that our lead levels were low and safe to grow, which was really awesome. So at a bare minimum, getting that lead testing done, and they do this in partnership with neighborhood organizations as well. So it might come to a neighborhood, might come to your neighborhood too, and you could look that up. Again, that's Allegheny Conservation District. The one that Grow Pittsburgh is partnering on is the one April 24th. And then also wanted to mention that there's a soil quality and crop nutrition workshop in partnership with PASA, April 14 at Bugs, the Black Urban Gardeners and Farmers Historic Farm in Homewood. So again, registration would be required for that. There's no link yet, but there is for the free lead testing. And then in general, I mentioned the free lead testing, bringing a sample of garden soil. They have great instructions also on that registration link. But essentially, you just go to the garden, take a sample as deep as you can go. Generally, 6 inches is really great. And then sampling from multiple places wherever you're wanting to grow, mixing those all up, letting them dry out a little bit, removing any rocks or sticks and those kinds of things, and then labeling them and sending them off to a lab to get tested. Most commonly, certainly lead and heavy metals, but also pH is really important, and organic matter and any nutrient deficiencies can all be revealed in a soil test, which is really super useful if you are having any issues in your garden. A soil test can be really revealing about ways to improve the soil. And some ones that we've used in the past, UMass is a really great one. Cornell, Penn State has a really basic soil test. I believe it's $9, but doesn't include lead, which is a whole other test. So there are a couple different ways. UMass, I think it's $25, but it includes lead and nutrients and pH. So really depending on what you want to do, you can pick and choose through some of them, or just send in one sample and get all the information. And they often can come with recommendations as well on how to improve the soil, which is super helpful. Especially sometimes those tests are really confusing when you get them back. So having something like a recommendation, UMass provides recommendations for sure, is really helpful. And dealing with lead is really challenging. We go at Grow Pittsburgh as an organization, we say less than 400 parts per million in the garden soil, but anything really 200 to 400 parts per million, it is safest, especially because we work with children, building raised beds instead of in the ground, because we can control the soil that way. We can put a weed or landscape fabric down to block that native soil and build up and ensure that the soil is safe. If you, for whatever reason, have to grow there and are trying to remediate the soil maybe, and those kinds of things, wear gloves and wash your produce really well. We did some really interesting tests at Braddock because the lead levels were really low, which is, why we have a farm there. We make sure, especially because, being next to a steel mill, making sure that we are doing routine soil tests. But the lead levels were very low, and they ended up doing a test where they were comparing washed and unwashed produce, and really just washing the kale made all of the difference, even though the lead levels were really low, or well within safe limits. It was unrecognizable when it was washed, and even when it was unwashed, it was extremely safe. So keep kids from any kind of contact. That's why wearing gloves, definitely keeping kids from touching their face or putting soil in their mouth. And then growing fruiting crops, something where if the lead is grown in, or if the plant's growing, the lead is being held in leaves versus, so something like kale, there's nowhere else for it to go. We're eating the leaves of that plant, versus a tomato, which is a fruiting crop. That might be a safer way to go. But again, this is all only less than 400 parts per million. Anything above that, making sure that we are growing above ground. Container garden soil is really important to consider, because there's a lot of different kinds of potting soil out there, and a lot of it is really great, but you have to make sure that you read the label. This Planting Pro potting soil from Ohio Earth Foods is what we use for all of our seedling sale. We grow about 30,000 seedlings at Grow Pittsburgh, and this is what we use for all of it, for seed starting, for up potting, for finished plants, all of that. And we love this product. We'll hopefully have it for sale at Garden Dreams once we start in-person sales, but I'm not sure where else you can buy it currently, but I can look into that too. But right on here, it says that there is enough nutrition to feed plants for 6 to 8 weeks, depending on the size of the pot. It also tells me that there's how much one bag does. So it tells me it'll do 128 cell plugs, which is really great, because then I know exactly how much soil I need. And it also tells me that it has compost, kelp, humates, rock phosphate, and rock minerals. So that has all the nutrition I need for the entire time that the plant is going to be in that pot. So it's a great option for a container garden as well. And again, it's not about this soil specifically. It's about reading the label to know whether it does have nutrients added. If it's a stale or sterile, just peat and perlite, there's no nutrients, you'll have to fertilize that plant a lot more often. You can reuse the soil, but it's often, if you've used it for an entire season, that there's not much life left in it. So you could use some of it and then just refresh it with compost or new nutrients, that kind of thing. But because I know it's really hard to get rid of container soil, but if you are reusing it, making sure that not, especially if anything that you planted in it had any disease issues or pest issues, those can harbor in the soil. So if you have any disease issues, definitely just get rid of that soil. It's not worth trying to fight that, or trying to add nutrients, those kinds of things. The diseases and pests will likely just stay in that soil. So if you have no issues, you could reuse it and just refresh it with compost and other potting soil. But otherwise, and again, sterilizing containers would be really important if you are experiencing disease or pest issues. And that's a lot easier with, if you have smaller containers and things, but we do that with anything that we're growing in year after year. So when we get to garden planning, I'm going to check my time quick. Okay, we've got a little bit more time, and then we'll have lots of time for questions as well. For garden planning, planting at the right time is super important. Once we've now built our garden, we have raised beds or containers or in-ground beds, or maybe a little bit of everything. Making sure we're planting the right things at the right time is really important. Otherwise, we end up with an unsuccessful garden just because of poor timing, which would be sad. So right now, we're coming to the end of March, which means we're getting ready to plant. I will be planting my peas very shortly. March, well, I think probably actually in the next couple of days, I'll be planting mine. I'm going to be transplanting them, but you can also direct seed them right now if you're really eager to get out there. Planting peas right around St. Patrick's Day is supposed to bring you good luck. So if you're interested in growing peas, that would be a great thing to start with. And then there's a bunch of other things: asparagus, broccoli, cabbage, kale, lettuce, onions, radishes, turnips, and then perennial and hardy herbs are all great things to plant at this time of year. Carrots are not on there. Definitely carrots would also be a great candidate for this time of year. And that's not to say that you can't plant them later, but that they really thrive in the cooler temperatures. So both spring and fall. And an important date for this spring and just cool season in general is that our last hard freeze is April 15th. So that's when the ground starts to thaw. That doesn't mean that we aren't going to have a frost, but the last hard freeze date for the ground being frozen solid is April 15. And so once we get past that date, we have a lot more flexibility with what we're planting, and all of these things would be great starting definitely April 15. We plant a lot of these things out at that time on our farm. Another thing that to pay attention to is the last frost date, and that is May 15. That's always just a guess. That's based on our hardiness zone. We here are in 6B, so our last frost date is right around May 15. If you had a garden last year and were really excited at this time, you may remember on May 9th, we had 27 degrees overnight, which if you had any of these things in the ground, they would not survive that. So we really suggest to wait till after May 15, unless you have serious garden protection, whether it be row cover or a hoop house or those kinds of things. But even these things will still not survive if it's a frost, even if it's got cover. These are very temperature sensitive crops here. So definitely wait until May 15. A lot of people say traditionally Memorial Day. Obviously Mother's Day is also a big one, but this year is May 9th. Mother's Day is May 9th. So be careful. It could be 27 degrees overnight. So making sure for basil, beans, cucumbers, eggplants, melons, peppers, tomatoes, zucchini, these are our heat loving crops. Even when we plant them in, say, May 15, they may not start growing really that much until we get consistent overnight temperatures into the 50s, 55, 60. That's really when they'll start to take off. So planting at the right time makes all the difference. Maybe we plant it May 15, but it's cool and wet and it doesn't grow at all. Somebody planting their tomatoes May 15, someone planting it May 31st may have the same size plants just because they planted at a time that it's warmer. So timing can definitely play a big part of that. And the Info Hub, the planting and harvesting chart, has all sorts of information about seed starting, harvesting, days to harvest, those kinds of things. So I think, oh yeah. And then for garden planting, we talked about how the southern exposure, the sun coming on, is really important. Something else really important would be the tall crops on the north facing side of the garden. So you can see this corn, if that was on the south facing edge of the garden, everything behind it would get totally shaded. So having our tallest crops on the north side is a really great way. It also just provides really beautiful structure to the garden by having trellises, things growing low, things growing tall. And even using your corn as a trellis would be a great way to do that too. Having beans growing up it, pumpkins or squash underneath is the traditional Three Sisters garden. So having, thinking about the way that the sun hits the garden is super important in terms of where and when we plant things. You can see there, it looks like there's some beans and cucurbits and maybe basil, all sorts of things in this garden. This is a really beautiful, diverse garden there. And then thinking about spacing, you know, each one, I have again an info hub thing for crop spacing chart. It depends on how we're planting, how much space we give things. Usually we stick to a pretty consistent thing, and each crop has its own unique spacing. And that's because of how tall it gets, how bushy it gets, how much room it needs for roots, something like a beet versus something that grows tall. And so considering the spacing is really important, because if you plant at an appropriate spacing, then there's less shading out of other crops, and it gets plenty of water and nutrients. So appropriate spacing is really important, especially you can then maybe get away with intercropping. This little raised bed here, it looks like there's lettuces. So in terms of spacing, maybe we plant radishes between those, which would technically be too close to the lettuces, but because the radishes are gonna, from harvest or seed to harvest, some radishes are only 21 days. We can harvest those before the lettuces even get big, and then we can get a lot more out of the space. But again, paying attention to the spacing, we know days to harvest and those kinds of things. So, and you can push that. There's, I think one important thing to note about spacing is that seed packets often talk about spacing for cultivation tools. So it's not about the requirement of the plant, but it's more about the requirement of tools or a tiller or a hoe, those kinds of things, or sometimes even like a mechanical harvester. So paying attention to the seed packets and really just growing from experience, that's going to be super helpful, because I have found we often plant things much closer, but that is because we know that our soil is very nutritious. We're supplying water, all of those kinds of things, so that we know that we can get a lot out of the soil. If your soil is not full of life and holding good moisture and that kind of thing, it would be a lot harder to plant things closer together. So spacing is super important, and there's lots of information out on the internet, and seed packets generally have good information, but sometimes you can get away with closer spacing. Especially it's about between rows. I think that's the biggest thing. Those are, if it says you need like 24 inches between rows for like arugula, that's because of a tool, not because the arugula needs 24 inches. So some of that is just experimentation, or looking at something like Grow Pittsburgh's guide versus the seed packet. So I know I went kind of fast here, but I want to leave lots of time for questions. And so this is my email. Feel free to email me. And then this is the end of part 1. But where we're leaving off tonight, we are going to pick up tomorrow for direct seeding, transplanting, talking about garden design. What else? Oh, Pest and Disease, touching slightly on that, because we do have, we could do whole workshops on pests and diseases. That's like a whole other thing, especially because if you don't have things growing at the moment, it's really hard to talk through, because, but we can at least talk about things to watch out for. And then on Saturday, just wanted to let everyone know, on Saturday, 10 to noon, I am teaching a seed starting workshop at home, seed starting at home workshop. It'll also be a webinar. So if you want to learn more about that, registration information is at Grow Pittsburgh. So, yeah, I have not been paying attention to the chat at all. So I hope people have.
Yeah, no, this was great. There's so much information. I think that we're all kind of absorbing.
I know I talk very fast also.
We can
Sorry
jump
about
down
that.
into the chat. Before we jump down in the chat, I actually have a stack of gardening books next to me because this is library time. But I did want to recommend one of my personal
Ooh.
favorites, which is the Postage Stamp Garden. So kind of like what Hannah was saying about spacing and everything, this really like shows a lot of like what I like are the very clear maps on how to do things and where to plant what. And so just
Absolutely.
a recommendation. It's widely available. And I think it's on Hoopla for instant download too, if you want to check something like that out. But let's jump into the chat and see what everyone's working on in their garden. And feel free to throw things and questions down here and we'll go through. It looks like Jamie's built a 16 by 16 foot fence to keep out the deer and start a brand new garden. I need some of that, which funny, speaking of the deer resistant garden.
Oh, I need that book for sure.
Deer are a major problem, at least in around CC Mellor in our neighborhoods. So good plan there. Looks like Heidi wants to grow tomatoes, but has been having a little bit of trouble. Do you have any tips?
Wait, wants to grow tomatoes? Is that what you said?
Tomatoes, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So Heidi, have you been growing them in the ground or in a container? Or I would love to know more about what you're struggling with, and maybe we can come to an idea.
Sounds good. Let's see. And it looks like Deanna has been gardening for a while and is trying dry beans. Ooh, that's new. That's exciting.
I love dry beans, Deanna.
Let's see. Kathleen thinks that her garden vegetables are so much better than store-bought, especially the pickling and cucumbers and peppers. Sounds like a good plan. That's one of our goals, isn't it, when we're gardening, is that to make all the effort worth it.
Exactly.
All right, here we have Christine has a patio garden with large containers out in Sheridan. Sonia has a few pots on her front stoop. Awesome. We have Resso from Nairobi, Kenya, who is starting with herbs and spices and loving it. Our international viewer, very excited. Anton has 2 plots at a community garden, so it sounds like you have a good amount of space to spread. Let's see, Pidge got their first house this year, and they're going to start their own garden.
Oh, that's exciting.
It seems like in that kind of case, you'd really want to get your soil tested.
Yeah, absolutely.
Direct to containers. Let's see. Christine wants to grow currant tomatoes, lemon, cucumbers, and Romanesco.
Ooh, that's fun. I've never grown Romanesco, but it's fun.
Oh, I just realized I could make this bigger. I'm just going through the little one. All right, here we go. It's more accessible. All right. Jane has a small flower garden, so she's gathering the pollinators for all of the neighbors' vegetable gardens. That's important.
That's great. Yeah.
Margaret has a small veggie patch with the sons, then grew lettuce and carrots and tomatoes and cucumber and peppers. Anton's looking for pointers on growing cauliflower, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts. Do you have any
yeah,
pointers?
That's great. We are trying out some sprouting broccoli this year at Shiloh, which I'm really excited about. But cauliflower, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts, I would say, those are longer season, and they just require a lot of space. Cauliflower, broccoli, and Brussels sprouts, I would give 18 inches. So depending on how close you're growing them together, and then some of them do better for our northern state. I think Snow Crown and Green King, and I'm trying to think of the other one that I was just looking up for broccoli. But there's I would say the variety is really important, looking for days to harvest so you know what to anticipate. And then a lot of times it's really about just fertility and making sure that there's lots of nutrients in the soil for those. And Brussels sprouts, they just take a really long time. They grow most of the season. But they have lots of really great, you can eat the greens. And if you cut the top off, a lot of times that'll put energy back into the Brussels sprouts forming. But I know that pests can definitely be anything in that brassica family: kale, collards, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts. Really keeping an eye on cabbage worms, cabbage loopers, those kinds of things are important to keep an eye on. But I don't know if you have any specific question, Anton, but otherwise those are the things that are on the top of my head. But yeah, tried growing tomatoes in a raised wooden table garden. Soil was between 1 and 2 feet deep. Tomatoes had black spots. The tomatoes had black spots on them. That probably, do you mean on the bottom, black spots on the bottom? That could be blossom end rot, or it could be late blight. I would think blossom end rot would be more likely in a container garden versus late blight, but it could be either. Without seeing a picture, I'm not quite sure. And the blossom end rot, if that is what you're talking about, where it has like the whole bottom just starts to rot, blossom end rot, and it starts to turn black, that's often two things: calcium deficiency, or just inconsistent watering, which can often be an issue. I mean, let's be serious. In my garden, there's no consistency with watering at all at my house, but especially in containers where there's not groundwater to pull from, consistent watering is much more important. That's the inconsistent watering makes it challenging for the tomatoes to pull calcium up. Even if there is calcium in the soil for it, the water is how those tomatoes are accessing that. So consistent water with containers is super important for tomatoes if that's what you are experiencing. Yeah. Do you have another question?
Looks like lots of people like growing herbs in containers. It seems to be the best way to do it. And Lisa had a question about volunteering opportunities for gardening in our area.
That's a great question. Yeah, certainly through Grow Pittsburgh at our production sites, something that we do as a more structured volunteer program at both Shiloh Farm and Braddock Farm. We have a work share program where people come. We have people come and volunteer for the entire season. They volunteer for 4 hours a week in exchange for a box of produce every week. That's sort of our most structured volunteer program, but we also have one-time things where you can email Grow Pittsburgh. Robert is the person, Robert at growpittsburgh.org is the one who coordinates our volunteers for our production sites. And then certainly we have a growers map on our website, and that if you type in where you live, you can find all the garden spaces in your community. And that would be a great way to reach out to specific gardens. If you have a community garden in your neighborhood that you want to reach out to, or looking at garden clubs would also be a great thing. I know here in Forest Hills, we have multiple gardening groups that are doing active programming and taking care of garden spaces all summer. So, well, I'm sure beyond the summer, but are active most in the summer. So that would be a great way to get connected. And also the schools, I think that, because the schools are well, I think they are reopening, but last summer they were closed. Families and community members were helping take care of the school gardens that we planted so that they did stay productive through the season. So that could also be a way that you get involved too.
I know that we're really appreciative of our community garden clubs in Forest Hills and in Edgewood. We've had, if you're familiar at all with our library, in Edgewood, we have the big pots out front. And so they usually plant those up and do small projects around our buildings, making it nice for patrons.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, Pidge is getting their soil tested. Sounds like a good plan.
Glad to hear it. I see a question here about what do I do about extremely large containers and the soil that's in them? They're almost like a raised bed. I can't afford to replace all that soil. Yeah, absolutely. So Christine, that is your question. If you are not experiencing pest or disease problems, you can probably just refresh with some fertilizer. I really love fish emulsion. It smells not great, but it is a wonderful fertilizer. It's organically approved and is a really wonderful, you can just mix it into a watering can, which makes it really easy. You can apply it as a foliar feed, so just spraying it on the plant or watering it into the container. And there's a lot, Home Depot and Lowe's and certainly our local garden centers, which are so fabulous. They have lots of, in the last few years, the organic options for pest, disease, and fertilization options have just like grown so much. It's really great because an easy way to find things that are organically approved is something, I'll type it in the chat, it's OMRI approved. And that stamp, OMRI approved, means that it's organically certified. Anyone who grows organically for the certification, that label has to be on it to be able to use it. That's for pest, disease, and fertilization. There's lots of rules around that. And so the OMRI, that tag, which again, you can get at lots of big box stores, but certainly local garden centers as well. We should certainly support them through these times because they know what we can grow best in our area. Also, Home Depot and Lowe's, that's a pretty, they'll have lots of generic options, but our local nurseries are the places that'll have that really great knowledge about what will grow best in our area. And when we, for our seedling sale at Grow Pittsburgh, we change out our varieties constantly to make sure that we have the best, most productive, or ones best for containers, things like that. And so talking to somebody growing in Pittsburgh is definitely the best way to go for that. And so I would say, Christine, adding nutrients that can be through just a powdered nutrients or through liquid fertilizer like a fish emulsion, which is really great. You could certainly add things like perlite and vermiculite. Perlite would be great to sort of loosen and aerate your raised bed soil if it's feeling really compacted. Adding compost would be a great way to do that too. If you join the Garden Resource Center, you can get some buckets of compost every month. So and hopefully that answers your question, but feel free to ask a follow-up, Christine, if you have anything else. So Jamie, we're turning a lawn into growing space for lots of veggies and some flowers. Friends have had success just rototilling over the grass several times. Does this sound feasible? Absolutely, Jamie, that's what we did in my yard for, I have about 12 beds right now. I'm going to be sheet mulching the rest of them because I don't want to move a tiller around anymore. But a rototiller is, it is a really great way to till up the soil and bring in some air and remove the soil or the grass, I should say. And then that'll break down and add organic matter back into the soil by rototilling. That'll stay there rather than something like removing the sod. You lose that, inches of soil that way. So being able to incorporate that in, that's what we've done. I would say the thing that we ran into in my yard, we bought our house about 2.5 years ago. We found out all sorts of weird things. The rototiller, depending on how deep, well, nothing was very even deep in our yard. It just was right at the surface. We found cinder blocks. We found all sorts of junk. So just, I would say, be careful, especially maybe stick a shovel in a couple places first, see what's under there. And then a rototiller can be a great option for that. And we do that at our farm as well as at Braddock. So couldn't get anything on that container. Maybe it wasn't looking at. Yeah, Heidi, that's a great idea. So if it's on the north side, I would say things that would be more shade tolerant, try lettuces, try arugula, try cilantro, try dill. A lot of herbs are very shade tolerant. You could do a perennial herb garden there probably in your table container. Those would all be better with less sun. Tomatoes absolutely need 6+ hours of sun. Otherwise they get really tall and leggy reaching for the sun and just do not produce tomatoes very well. And that, I guess, could be contributing depending on the black rot on the end too. So, oh, Paige, you live in Forest Hills too. That's exciting. We're neighbors.
I'm glad you guys like the presentation. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to throw them in the chat. Are we too late for indoor seedling? I don't think so. For vegetable seeds,
Oh no, you should come to my
Everyone's
class on
kind of just starting
Saturday.
flower seeds now. I'm like, I've got my list of indoor flower seeds, but flower seeds take much longer than vegetable seeds, and those are just getting started now. I think Hannah would know better, but most vegetable seeds, when do you start those?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's definitely not too late for indoor seedlings. So I'm teaching a class on Saturday all about starting seeds at home. So for
We have
example,
a link to that
yes.
somewhere.
Okay. And actually, yeah, I can find that. And then also the other thing is that Johnny's website, let me just pull it up really quick, because Johnny's website has this really wonderful calculator. Johnny's, oh, what is it? Seed starting date. So actually, I'll just show you this whole thing. You can see my screen, right? Do you see Johnny's website right now?
Yes.
Great. So this growers library, Johnny's is a place where we buy tons of seeds. We buy, I think so many hundreds of thousands of seeds I buy through Johnny's every year. They're a really fabulous company, and they have this growers library that is just a huge wealth of knowledge. And it's one of my most favorite things. I come and look at things on here all the time, and this planning tools and calculators, I think it's probably under here. So this has how many seeds to buy, caterpillar tunnels, seed starting date calculator for seedlings. So this one, they have all these things where they're really adaptable. So you can say, this here says enter spring frost-free date. So we know that's not March. We know that that's actually May 15. I'm going to select that here. And now it's going to change all of my dates to when I should start them. And it gives you a range. So we can start collards from March 6th through March 20th to plant outside on the right, April 17. We can certainly plant them past that, but it's telling us it's a safe time to set plants outside 4 weeks before our frost-free date. We know collards are hardy. That's why we can do that. Something like if we go down to tomatoes, it's going to take 6 to 8 weeks. So we have from March 27th to April 17th to start the seeds. And we want to plant them outside 1 to 2 weeks after our last frost-free date. So that's May 22nd to May 29th. That is really insurance that our plants don't die if we plant them at our frost-free date. So some things like watermelon, again, I had mentioned the melons are very overnight temperature sensitive. So they really want those warmer nighttime temperatures too. So we can plant those outside inside May 1 to May 8 for 2 weeks after our last frost-free date, May 29. So, I've been farming for 12 years now, but I still reference these kinds of tools all the time because they're just so helpful. And to be able to change this, I realistically, will not get a lot of things out May 15th because that's right after Mother's Day. It's a huge, really busy time for my seedling sale. So the things that say 2 weeks after, that's perfect for me for planting outside. I know that it's going to be warmer and safer, and also just because that's realistically when I'll get to it. So kale, kohlrabi, leeks, lettuce, so many things can be planted before that date. But you can see the range here for starting indoors. The only thing, all of these are right now. The only thing that is even coming close is really that it says through March 20th for collards, but that's just if you want to get it out on that April 17th day. We plant collards in June as well. So it's certainly not too late to do that. This is just the earliest date you could do that. So there's a lot of information in these tools. This is one of my favorites, the seed starting date calculator. You can manipulate the dates. It'll give you whole new information. So this is a really great tool. And again, this was Johnny's Growers Library seed starting date calculator. So not too late, definitely not too late. Yes, thank you. Perfect.
Yes, I'm trying to put all the links down.
No, I appreciate it.
So the seed starting seminars down in there, as well as the Johnny's seed starting calendar. I know that there has been a run kind of on getting seeds, and if you have things in mind, the sooner the better. Johnny's actually shut down a little while ago for like personal buying, just to wholesalers, but I think they're back up now. But
yeah, I think that that's true. But either way, I think places like the East End Food Co-op does have seeds for sale. We'll have seedlings for sale at the East End Co-op starting at the end of March. In 2 weeks, we'll have our first delivery to the East End Food Co-op. All of our hardiest things are kales, collards. We're gonna have some annual flowers that are really a hardy, perennial flowers, and a bunch of perennial herbs. They look so good right now. So we're excited to get those out into the hands of people. So yeah, but if anybody else has any questions, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, that's my email. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions about farm stand or growing a garden or seed starting,
yeah.
any of those things.
And remember to come back tomorrow for our part 2, where I think we'll get a
Mhm.
little bit more into the plant part of the organic gardening.
Oh, okay. I see another question from Christine about if the pests were too much of an issue. So that would really be about observation, Christine. If you had pests, there are certain things that will overwinter in the soil. That's something like, what's a good example? Like Harlequin beetles. I don't know if you've ever had Harlequin beetles. They're awful on brassicas, mustards, kale, collards, those kinds of things. And they will overwinter in the soil. So if you have anything like that, and really it's about just being able to identify pests is really important, because then you will know if they are something that would like overwinter in the soil. But if you didn't have pests, then it's not an issue. If you did have pests, I think figuring out what it was, if it was something like a cabbage worm or caterpillars, those often do not overwinter in the soil. But and the other thing that you could do that just popped into my head would be rotating your crops. So if you had something that was like a Harlequin beetle that really loves brassicas, if you planted something else in there, potentially it would move on, because it was, not an attractive plant for that. So if you planted a tomato, or if you planted something, a bean or something like that, that could be a way that you get around that too. But again, it's really just if you didn't have any pests, then you don't have to worry about it. But you would know if the pests were too much of an issue. If you struggled with, growing something in a pot, then I really do. I know it's time and money and energy and all of that to replace the soil, but you either pay for it now or you pay for it later if you plant the same kind of thing that's going to deal with the same kind of pests. And there's just so much heartbreak when that happens. If just spending the time and energy to replace that and get that really healthy. Pests are also often attacking plants that are struggling a little bit. It could be fertility. Last year, we transplanted some okra outside, and the transplants did not look good at all. And we just planted them because we were late and we planned for an entire bed of okra. So we planted them, and not a week later, they were covered in aphids. And then we direct seeded a bed of okra right next to it. So they were transplanted, sad transplants, and then direct seeded right into the soil. And the ones that were direct seeded that just grew and were healthy from the beginning, they never had aphids and grew so much bigger and healthier than the other transplants. So pests can often be a sign of other issues going on, fertility, or or just struggling plants. Those okra were so sad. We should not have planted those, but
I feel like last year was an especially bad bug year, though. I had like crazy bug issues, and everyone I was talking to had crazy bug issues, which is so demoralizing when you put, you're spending money, you're putting your time, your love into watching your plants, talking to your plants, all the things.
Yeah, totally. So I think that, and that is a natural part of gardening, right? There's never going to be a year that we don't have any pests, but I do feel like in the last couple of years, there have been new pests and pests I had never seen before. And certainly at certain garden sites having them and not at others. So it is really interesting. We can always, last year we had a horrible flea beetle year. We just really struggled with flea beetles, and we even used insect netting as a cover for them. But because the flea beetles are so small, they just, they can get anywhere. It is so tough. So flea beetles, and then aphids. We always deal with aphids too. But we'll talk more about pests and diseases tomorrow. Christine, where do you get rid of the soil? Where do you dump it? That is a good question. So I know here in Forest Hills, we have a trailer that is down at our municipal building that we can just bring yard waste to. I think it's like April through November, which is awesome. So I brought a bunch of other things down there this year from our yard. But otherwise, if you don't have a compost pile, that's a good question.
So there are several locations throughout Pittsburgh that accept yard waste because I think it's like technically slightly illegal to throw it away in your trash. And one of them, the one I always use that's closest at least to where our library is because I live in the neighborhood is see now I'm looking for the right one, so I'm sending you guys the right link. It's fairly close. I think, is it in Homestead? The Hazel.
Homewood?
Oh yeah. So there's the East End drop-off center that is.
I don't know about this.
This is
That's so great.
recycling. I'm on the wrong link. Here we
Oh,
go.
is it
Yard waste.
AgriCycle? No.
There's a city one that gets run by, yes, the East End drop-off center is on Hamilton Avenue. I'm gonna put and it's any kind of yard waste except I think like large branches, but
Yeah.
I've put, all kinds of, if I'm like weeding and it won't fit in my compost bin, I'll, fill one of those big brown bags.
Yeah,
And then
exactly.
throughout the season, they'll have curbside pickups too of like yard waste. The city will do that. I always seem to miss those, but I put the link to the.
Oh yeah, that's great. And then AgriCycle, I think is that's a place where we buy a lot of our compost. And if you go to the Garden Resource Center, that's where we get leaf mulch and topsoil and compost from. And they are awesome. And they have a lot of different sort of blends of soils as well, which is really great. And I believe they take municipal yard waste. So, yeah.
But yes. And the Pittsburgh one is free. So
that's great. Yeah. I feel like that could add up for sure if you're collecting lots of yard waste.
Yeah.
So,
no, and I think they process it. They have, much more industrial level composting systems so that they process it and then it goes back into our parks. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And through Forest Hills, every year I've gotten the compost, the leaf compost that from when they do the street cleanings, they compost all of that. And that's what I've been amending a lot of my soil with. And it is just amazing from the 2 years that we've been doing this, the structure and texture of our soil it's unrecognizable as the place we were pulling cinder blocks out of, which is so great. So that's a really awesome resource. And you can go and collect buckets of it at Forest Hills. And I think, because we're a borough, we are not part of the city of Pittsburgh. I don't know, neighborhood wide what it is, but certainly there are lots of resources. And I think that is why the Garden Resource Center is such a wonderful resource, because then you don't have to get truckloads or pay for delivery and those kinds of things. You can get smaller amounts every month, but have access to the knowledge and to the tools and those kinds of things. So especially for like pest and disease control, if you're just want to try something out, being able to go and get 1 cup of something rather than investing a lot of money in a new amendment or spray or whatever, that's a really great way to do it too. So I want to say the membership for the Garden Resource Center, at least in the past, I'm not sure if it went up this year, but in the past it was only $40 for the year. So it's a great price. So, but yeah, I'm looking forward to, hopefully a lot of you will be here tomorrow too, and we'll pick up where we left off. We'll probably overlap just a little bit about this garden spacing and then move on through picking crop varieties and spacing and direct seeding and transplanting and all that fun stuff. So yeah, thanks so much.
Awesome. Thank you guys. And this was so much fun. We will see you tomorrow.
Awesome. Thanks so much.